The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Tammany Hall no longer exists, but when it did, the New York political machine created a social safety net at the neighborhood level long before government programs came along. Author Terry Golway thinks we still need strong political organizations like that. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Terry Golway is a professor at Keene University in New Jersey. He's a historian, author, and a journalist who has written for the New York Times and the New York Observer. And his latest book is Machine Made, Tammany Hall, and the Creation of Modern American Politics. Terry Golway, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's my pleasure.
Now, you've written a history of an institution that lasted maybe over a century, but which most of our listeners really don't know about. What was Tammany Hall, and what role did it play in national Democratic politics?
Well, Tammany Hall was both a building, which is to say, it was a meeting hall, and it also was the controlling faction of the Democratic Party in Manhattan. So in essence, when we talk about Tammany Hall, we're talking about the Democratic Party in New York, but specifically Manhattan. That was sort of their geographical center. And, because Tammany Hall existed at a time when New York was a political colossus. I mean, New York in the early to mid-20th century had the most number of electoral votes, and it produced, the Democratic Party's presidential candidate from 1928 all the way to 1944. So it was the center of Democratic politics in the same way that today you might argue that Texas is the center of Republican politics. There was New York, and then there was the rest of the country. And Tammany Hall, as the leading Democratic faction in New York, had a very large influence over national politics in the early to mid-20th century.
What role did Irish immigrants play in the development of Tammany? And was it a class warfare thing against New York's Dutch and British elites, kind of a continuation of the Irish Anglo Wars of old?
Absolutely. When the Irish began coming to New York and to the rest of the country in large numbers in 1847, which is when the famine breaks out in Ireland, during the course of 5 years in Ireland, the population went from 8 million to 5 million. 1 million people starved to death in Ireland, and 2 million people emigrated. Many, of course, came to the United States. Many come to New York. And there are two kinds of reaction, not just in New York, but in Boston and other places. One reaction is that of the nativists, who say, who are these people? They are aliens. They have a different sort of religion. Many of these Irish people did not speak English. They spoke Irish. They were different. They were un-American. They were unworthy of what was seen to be a Protestant republic. That was one reaction. Then there was a reaction of organizations like Tammany Hall, which said, these people could be voters. We can assimilate them into America. We can make them our allies. Now, of course, there's some self-interest going on there, but if you're an immigrant and you come to these shores, you have hostility on one end and friendliness on the other. Well, which side are you going to choose? But the other thing that the Irish immigrants recognized was the as you suggested, the same sort of cultural attitudes that they had experienced in Ireland, where their religion was considered a mark of inferiority, where their culture was considered inferior. So they leave Ireland where they're oppressed, and they come to New York and other places where civic elites are basically saying, well, you're not worthy of liberty. You're Irish. You're Catholic. You're lazy. You don't understand these elite concepts of freedom. So the language of reform was very similar in New York as it was in Ireland, and the Irish reacted accordingly. They went with an organization, Tammany Hall, that did not presume to judge them from a cultural standpoint. All they wanted to do was assimilate them.
Yeah, machines like Tammany nominated people for office in the smoke-filled back rooms. In a way, didn't that produce better leaders than nominating them through low-turnout primaries? kind of like what we do today.
Well, yeah.
I mean, the reference here is to what is happening now in the Republican Party.
Well, exactly. And I listen. I don't think anybody wants to go back to the days where a boss of a large organization sits down with his all-white male, cigar-smoking colleagues and decides on who will be the nominee. But there's no question, though, that system worked quite often. I mean, I would argue that it worked. It reached its zenith in 1944 when the bosses in a back room chose Harry Truman to be the vice president in place of Henry Wallace, for Franklin Roosevelt's fourth term. I think that was a very wise choice by these bosses. And I think that history has proven that Truman was a pretty darn good president, and Henry Wallace might not have been a very good president. So I think that the reference to a smoke-filled room these days is often a pejorative. It's often seen as the absolute symbol of corrupt government. I think that we have to rethink that and perhaps acknowledge that the system, however flawed, that system actually did work on occasion.
For that time.
For that time, absolutely.
Yeah. We're speaking with Terry Golway, professor at Keene University in New Jersey, a historian, author. He's written for the New York Times and the New York Observer, and his latest book is Machine Made, Tammany Hall and the Creation of Modern American Politics. Tammany Hall was the epitome of a big city political machine, which most people might think is a bad thing. But wasn't it really a model of retail politics where leaders listened to the people where they lived and actually provided a social safety net?
There's a reason, yes, absolutely. There's a reason why Tammany Hall succeeded, and that's because it responded to its constituents' needs. There was a famous Tammany figure by the name of George Washington Plunkett, and he's famous because a political reporter in the early 20th century walked around with him for several days and just spent the day writing up his monologues, and it was turned into a book. And on one particular day that this reporter by the name of William Reardon, he spent the day with Plunkett as he went about his duties as a district leader, which is sort of a mid-level operative within the Tammany organization. And the day started with a knock on Plunkett's door at 4 o'clock in the morning or something like that because some local kid got in trouble and needed to be bailed out. The day starts with that and ends at midnight, and the story of what this guy did during those many hours will tell you exactly why this organization succeeded, because he's constantly meeting with constituents, meeting with people who are in touch with other constituents. I mean, his full-time job is listening to constituents, not listening to donors. Right? And I think there's the big difference between the politics of yesterday and the politics of today. George Washington's Plunkett was spent 15, 16, 17 hours of dealing with constituents instead of, dealing with would-be donors and trying to shake money out of contributors. So these organizations had their finger on the pulse of the needs of their voters, and that's why they succeeded. I think that a lot of historians argue that machines like Tammany succeeded because they intimidated voters or because and this is the part that I really hate, that voters were too stupid and too ignorant to recognize their own interests. I disagree profoundly, and my book makes the argument that these voters knew exactly what they were doing, that Tammany was responsive to their needs, and other political organizations too, and when they failed to respond to those needs, they suffered at the polls. It was that simple.
Mm-hmm. Is there a role today for urban political organizations like Tammany anymore? I mean, maybe that kind of organization's been replaced by advocacy groups or even by social media?
Yes, I do think that they have been replaced by social media and advocacy groups, but I do think there's still a place for the old-fashioned political clubhouse. And you know what? There still are a few in New York, and I imagine there are a few in Boston and Chicago and some of the old places, but there's actually still a remnant of Tammany Hall 50 years after it collapsed on 9th Avenue in Hell's Kitchen. There's a place called the McManus Association where if you're a constituent, you can go into that clubhouse. You need help maybe with a matter of law enforcement, or you need a job, or you need some training. There are people working in that political organization who will try and match you up with the bureaucracy or try to advocate for you with the local politicians. And, I think that if there were a better and stronger connection between local neighborhoods in urban areas and politics, maybe we would see greater political participation. And after all, isn't that what we're supposed to be all about?
There's an anecdote you mentioned about Al Smith campaigning to repeal Prohibition and warning that pretty soon you won't be able to stand at 42nd Street and Broadway and smoke a cigar. That pretty much came to pass under Mayor Bloomberg, did it not?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly why I have it in the book. And I had no idea that I was going to come across that anecdote, but I did see that Smith was speaking at the opening of the Tammany Hall building in 1929, and that building still exists over by Union Square in Manhattan. And he's railing on about Prohibition. Tammany was against Prohibition. And of course, in 1929, a fair amount of the country was against Prohibition, at least in urban areas. And Smith was saying, listen, if they want to control your drinking, and before you know it, you're not going to be able to, as you said, smoke a cigar on the corner of 42nd and Broadway. And I write in the introduction, I said, most of the people in the audience probably thought this was inconceivable. And of course, here we are in 2014, and it is actually quite believable.
Yep. And by the way, put down that large soda. Terry Golway, professor at Keene University in New Jersey. His latest book is Machine Made, Tammany Hall and the Creation of Modern American Politics. Terry, we very much enjoyed your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org, and hopefully we can do it again soon.
It's my pleasure. I look forward to it.
All right, and this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Although we haven't even gotten through this year's midterm congressional elections, it's still not too early to start examining some of the characters who hope you will make them president in 2024. I know you don't want to, but we must. That's because corporate elites have already chosen their favorites, and they intend to use massive sums of money, lies, more money, PR slick'em, and even more money to slide their toady into the Oval Office, hoping you don't discover until it's too late that their chosen one really is a toad. Take Ron DeSantis. The GOP's far-right, power-hungry, narcissistic Florida governor promises to be the next Donald Trump, only more effective and not as nice. For example, his favorite gubernatorial hobby is the Orwellian practice of monitoring and censoring people's speech and thoughts, culling out ideas he deems objectionable. Don't say gay is his most infamous dictate to the state's teachers, but he has also outlawed any teachings that might, quote, denigrate the Founding Fathers. Nor will he tolerate the study of institutional racism in America. Indeed, he has even mandated that social studies textbooks, get this, must not include concepts of social justice. Ron adamantly opposes what right-wingers call a woke society. He wants one that's asleep, sound asleep. He recently rallied his right-wing cadre to ban some math textbooks. Yes, math. They screeched that some real-life topics like wage disparities are being used to make math problems relevant to today's students. So it was Fahrenheit 451 for those books. Thus far, DeSantis' censorship binge has nixed 42 math books for, quote, incorporating prohibited topics. This is Jim Hightower saying, did I mention that DeSantis is also forming his own gubernatorial military force? A state army he can deploy in emergencies. What's an emergency? He says he'll decide. Howdy-ho, folks. Thanks for tuning in and sharing my weekly commentaries. Also, please join me for a live web show I host every other Tuesday, the Hightower Lowdown Happy Hour at the Chat and Chew Cafe. You can join the action live online as I chat with grassroots leaders and progressive sparklies from around the country. Go to hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew to find out about upcoming guests and watch past episodes. That's hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. New Deal historian Harvey Kaye says President Reagan turned FDR upside down and inside out, and progressives have to reclaim his legacy. And we are joined now by Harvey Kaye, who is the Ben and Joyce Rosenberg Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. His latest book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made the Greatest Generation Truly Great. Harvey Kaye, thank you very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you. It's great to be talking to you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you with us. To begin with, a lot of our listeners may not know exactly what you mean by the four freedoms. Can you tell us what they are and how they developed?
Okay, well, it's important just to state that the four freedoms was a vision or a promise articulated by Franklin Roosevelt in January 1941 in his annual message to Congress, which we think of as the State of the Union message each year. And in this speech, he was warning Americans of the dangers of the war already underway in Europe and in Asia, and how there was no doubt that, as he said, the dictators were going to target us. He had little doubt. And that because of that, it was necessary for the United States to prepare for war. But the preparation for war, or at least preparation for a major national defense, also involved a Lend-Lease program for Britain, which was already under siege, obviously, by the Nazis, by Germany. But what he also said, and this is the fundamental thing, is merely because we face this crisis of security, merely because, our lives are threatened by this war, doesn't mean we should give up or suspend what we've achieved during the last 8 years of the New Deal in the fight against the Great Depression. He said, rather than give up, if we're going to prepare for war, if we're really going to sustain ourselves in advance, what we need to do is actually build upon what we've achieved. And he laid out a series of initiatives that they might pursue to sustain the New Deal and advance it. And then he said, looking ahead, in his own mind, expecting war, he said, beyond the war, we need to make a world characterized by four essential human freedoms. And those four freedoms, he said, were freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, and then, he went on and said, freedom from want and freedom from fear. So the four freedoms are those: freedom of speech and expression and worship, freedom from want and fear. And they became basically the ideals for which the Americans fought during the Second World War, when, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th later that year.
Mm-hmm. Is it too much of a stretch to say the four freedoms are what we fought World War II about? I mean, that is to say, were they on the minds of the average soldier on the battlefield?
Well, that's a really good question, because pollsters of the day, and especially, and even historians to this day, say, well, most Americans weren't thinking about the four freedoms. They couldn't even recite them exactly. And, there's good evidence. But actually, I've found plenty of evidence that most Americans actually had those four freedoms on their minds. Freedom of speech and freedom from worship were fundamental to the American understanding of democracy. But also freedom from want and fear. They had just fought 8 years of battles against the powers that be, both political and especially corporate, to begin to attain freedom from want and fear. And they had no intention of giving all of that up in a defeat by fascists and imperialists. The other thing is that in the course of the war, not only were major groups and major organizations regularly pronouncing the imperative of fighting for the four freedoms, but when soldiers were asked to talk about what they were fighting for, even though they couldn't recite the four freedoms exactly, they pretty much talked about just those kinds of things, from the freedom of speech and worship to freedom from want and fear. Now, they may all have had their own understandings of that, but they all seem to be envisioning that what they had done in the 8 years before the war is what they were fighting about, and they had no intention of coming back and suffering a reversal of what they had achieved and might yet achieve.
We're speaking with Harvey Kaye, professor of democracy and justice studies at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, and discussing his latest book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made the Greatest Generation Truly Great.
There's something I want to add to what I just said about did they have it on their mind? This is really crucial. In 1943 and 1944, Roosevelt commissioned the National Opinion Research Center, which was then at Princeton University, to run a series of surveys and ask Americans what they wanted to achieve after the war. And a series of possibilities were listed. And regularly, to the tune of 85%, Americans endorsed the idea of guaranteed work for all, of aid to students to go to university, of national health care. I mean, on every single question that implied a liberal or social democratic vision, 85%, that includes Republicans and Democrats, 85% of Americans said that's what they wanted, which led Roosevelt then in 1944 to expand upon the four freedoms and give a new State of the Union address, January 44, which comes to be known as the Second Bill of Rights speech, in which he lays out the idea, the possibility of enacting new amendments to the Constitution guaranteeing essentials for economic security for Americans. I just think it's important to realize just how great Americans had in their minds, how strong they had in their minds, that they had already begun in the 30s the battle for the four freedoms, and they had no intention of turning around but actually advancing them. I just think that's really important to remember.
And the president listened to the people.
He did indeed, and he, as I say, and he proclaimed and pronounced the new economic Bill of Rights in 44.
Yeah. Now, your book takes aim at the trope created by President Reagan, his speechwriters, and Tom Brokaw, that the people who lived through the Depression and World War II were the greatest generation. Isn't labeling one generation as better than another kind of ridiculous?
Well, definitely not. Okay, I mean, the greatest generation deserves that title. These young men and women of the 30s and 40s who went on to make the United States the strongest and richest nation on earth, and then followed through on their promise in the 1960s by way of Medicare, Medicaid, Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Acts, EPA, OSHA, Consumer Product Safety Commission, and reformed the immigration laws, which had not been reformed since 1924. So this was an amazing generation. But the thing is, they would be great merely for having won World War II. But what made them the greatest generation is that they were the most progressive generation in American history, which, by the way, Reagan had every intention of suppressing the memory of. I mean, by the 1970s, as he's running for president, well, he ran first in 68, but when he ran in the 1970s, he made every effort to suppress the memory of what that generation, his own generation, was about. And if you read Tom Brokaw's work, though he gives a nod to their, liberalism, Brokaw and the rest of the Greatest Generation tribunes make nothing of the progressivism from the 1930s to the 1960s that marks so much of that generation.
Well, you mentioned President Reagan, a New Dealer who became very conservative. How did he exploit the four freedoms for his own purpose? Was it a dishonest rendering of history?
Oh, regularly. I mean, it's interesting that when he was running for president and then accepted the nomination in 1980 from the Republicans, he was a master of using, but even more to the point, abusing the past. His acceptance speech at the Republican convention quotes Lincoln, Thomas Paine, the American revolutionary, and Franklin Roosevelt, taking their ideas out of context and somehow making them a champions of conservative politics, which is absolutely absurd. But what happens is Reagan knows who the heroes of American working people are: Lincoln, Paine, and Roosevelt. And keep in mind, most working people by the late 1970s are absolutely fed up with the Carter administration because Carter had turned out to be not at all the liberal that he had appeared to be, that he had run as in 1976. So Reagan is trying to appeal to what later comes to be known as the Reagan Democrats by literally sort of pronouncing the Reagan Revolution by using Lincoln's, Paine's, and Roosevelt's words. Now, while he was president, Reagan, he would regularly refer to the four freedoms, but never mention what they were. And why was that? Because he had every intention of rewriting them. And in 1987, July 3rd, 1987, he went to a Chamber of Commerce gathering, huge numbers of people at the Jefferson Memorial of all places. And he announces his intention of seeking to enact a new economic Bill of Rights, playing off of Roosevelt's ideas. But what his Bill of Rights involves, that is Reagan's, is basically free markets and free markets and free markets. And it's a complete denial of the idea of economic security that Roosevelt and a generation had fought for. And then, over and over again thereafter, and especially even in his farewell address, when he says to the American people, we must teach our young people that America is about freedom. And he makes every effort to expunge freedom from want and fear once again when he says America is about freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom of enterprise. Now, I could go on and on about Ronald Reagan and those four freedoms, but what we find is a man who had memorized so many of Roosevelt's speeches because he was such a fan of Roosevelt, and later becomes not simply a Cold Warrior, which, that in itself was not a surprise, but that he becomes a right-winger. It really was opposed to Social Security, wanted to privatize the TVA. You name it, the New Deal for him was now the evil. And in the 70s, when he's running for office, he keeps playing on the Roosevelt stuff, but in a way that literally turns Roosevelt upside down or inside out. But keep in mind, whatever Reagan did, whatever he did to suppress the memory of what the four freedoms were really about, let's not forget that we liberals and progressives had failed to sustain that vision.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Harvey Kaye, professor of democracy and justice studies at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, and discussing his latest book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms. To the extent that the Depression and World War II generation did overcome incredible obstacles, do you think it was more the legacy of belief in the four freedoms and the success of the New Deal than their exploits on the battlefield?
Let's put it this way, okay? I think what we need to consider is that both the New Deal and World War II are part of the same ongoing struggle in many ways. Okay, the New Deal enables the mobilization against fascism and imperialism in World War II. Imagine if the United States had not pursued the New Deal with its relief, recovery, reconstruction, and reform efforts. It's hard to imagine the United States could ever have risen to the challenge that it faced in 1941 and 1942. So I think that the legacy of belief in the four freedoms, that it comes out of the New Deal. It's articulated by Roosevelt in 1941, and then the pursuit of the war and the deep commitment that Americans had to those four freedoms, and the understanding that they would, if you like, reinvigorate the struggles against inequality, the struggles against labor exploitation, the struggle against poverty, the fight against soil erosion and the devastation of the environment, that all of those things that had been happening in the New Deal, that's on the minds. I mean, the capacity to believe in America is renewed in the 1930s. So maybe, I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, but I think it's important to realize that this is the creation of a generation, and that the overcoming of the obstacles are both the overcoming of the obstacles of the Depression and the confrontation with fascism and imperialism. Does that get at what you're asking?
I think so. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's where we'll end it. Harvey Kaye, Ben and Joyce Rosenberg, Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. The book is The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made the Greatest Generation Truly Great. Harvey Kaye, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Look forward to having you back again soon.
I look forward to it, too. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
There's a poll that came out yesterday that 71% of two polls, the Associated Press and the New York Times, 71% of Americans believe that democracy is on the line in these midterm elections. Are they right?
Yes, but not in the way you might think that affirmative answer might suggest. First of all, if you look at the polling data, Republicans and Democrats think that, but for different reasons. Okay. And the question about how safe, how secure, how durable our democracy is not one that David and I shy away from, because it's an answerable question. And we write in the book that back in the 1990s, and Bill, you remember this era, or the early 2000s, there was a lot of political science research, and I know this because my wife's a political scientist, and lots of people who thought about democracy and elections, who wrote columns wondering why turnout wasn't better, and was democracy dying from lack of interest and apathy. You might remember those stories. We're not in that scenario anymore. Mm-hmm. There's a tremendous amount of energy about democracy and what it is and how it functions, and will it continue? We had record turnout in the 2018 midterm election, the highest in 100 years. We had the highest turnout in the 2020 presidential election of any presidential election in our country's history. We're going to have very high turnout in this midterm election. So at that level, democracy, participating, voting, energy, no, it's not in jeopardy in a classical sense, okay? Does it have risks built into some of the conversations around democracy? The answer absolutely is yes, and that's why we wrote this book. Some of the conversation around democracy is it doesn't function. We don't count votes. Something went wrong in 2020. We wrote this book to make it absolutely clear nothing went functionally wrong with the 2020 election. You may not have liked the outcome. That happens with every election. We all know. But not only did nothing go wrong in 2020, we as a country did an amazing thing. We had the highest turnout, I mentioned that, most diverse electorate, in the teeth of a global pandemic without vaccines. Voting, whether you're an election worker or a voter, is a social process. You go to the polls, you work the polls. It's not on Zoom. You have to go there. You have to be there. You have to be up close. Risky thing during a pandemic, we all remember. And yet we achieved this thing. Record turnout. with all these problems, all these uncertainties, all these required adaptations. That speaks to an underlying strength, a great resiliency in democracy. Something that I was sort of expecting, and David and I were sort of expecting we would have celebrated as a country, as epitomizing really strong American traits: ingenuity, collaboration, cooperation, doing hard things under a lot of pressure, big deadline. Oh no, there wasn't a parade, there wasn't a celebration, there was a slandering. And that's the part of this equation that jeopardizes democracy, the slandering of an election because you weren't happy with the way it turned out.
Obviously, when some people say democracy is in peril, they mean our election system is in peril because there are people running for office. Well, there's a former president who still insists he won and it was stolen. And a lot of people believe him. And there are people running for office today who want to really further undermine the basic democratic process. Then there are other people, when they say democracy is in peril today, they think that means because we're all going to become socialists the way we're going, right? So what does that tell us, this 71%, David?
This dichotomy is actually the reason that we wrote the book. The reality by any objective measure of the 2020 election is, as Major said, it was one of the greatest triumphs of the American democratic process in history. If you look at the objective measurements of what we would look at for a successful democracy, a successful democratic process, we had more paper ballots that are verifiable, auditable, and recountable than ever before. 95% of all ballots in 2020 were paper, verifiable paper. Every single battleground state had paper. That wasn't the case in 2016, by the way. It was only about 75 to 80%. Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania all had significant numbers, if not entirely statewide, no paper, no ability to audit or recount. We had more audits of those paper ballots than ever before. 43 states in D.C., including all of the battleground states, confirmed that the technology counted them correctly, most famously in Georgia, where they literally counted over 5 million paper ballots by hand. They didn't have paper ballots in 2016. We had more pre-election litigation to clarify the rules. On election night, everyone who was participating in the election knew those rules. Nobody liked all the rules, but they all knew those rules. And they went into this process knowing the rules and having a full opportunity to litigate them and clarify them. And then we had more post-election litigation in 2020 than we've ever had before. Over 60 cases, 8 Trump-appointed judges unanimously found that there was absolutely no evidence to suggest that the outcome was wrong. And in fact, we sit here today, on this date, 716 days since the November 2020 election. There has still not been one piece of evidence, not one shred of evidence presented to any court or law enforcement that would suggest that there was any problem with the 2020 election. And yet, we have tens of millions of people who have been lied to, have been targeted for grift, who've been exploited. Their sincere disappointment in the outcome of the election has been exploited. All the 74 million people who voted for former President Trump are not insurrectionists. They're people who preferred President Trump to now President Biden, and they have been the target of a long grift. Their sincere disappointment has been exploited to lead them to believe that the only definition of a secure election is an election in which their candidate wins. No democracy can survive that. Is there anyone in this country that, in a 50-50 divided country, that hasn't experienced a sincere disappointment and an electoral defeat in the last decade? I would suggest there isn't. That's the way elections work. There are winners, there are losers. We accept the outcome and the will of the voters. Sometimes our side wins, sometimes our side loses. That is being turned on its head. That is an unsustainable position for a democracy. It cannot sustain itself, it cannot survive if a significant percentage of people cannot accept defeat when the outcome is so clear and when the process is so secure and has so much integrity.
That certainly resonates with me as someone who has probably voted for more losers than winners. I mean, I'm a Democrat. What can I say?
But Bill, in your previous life in California, you know what it means when we say when everyone knows the rules, you've got to play by the rules and win under the rules.
Absolutely.
That's what state parties do. That's what national parties do. That's what candidates do. That's the way it works.
No,
you may litigate before. The only thing you can litigate after is if there is a demonstrable, provable, evidentiary-based violation of those rules or disenfranchisement. That's the only way you can have standing. You know that.
No, I know that as a volunteer. I know it as a campaign manager. I know it as a candidate who lost and then moved on, accepted the result.
Right.
I know that as a former state chair of California. But I don't want you to cross the line into partisanship at all. But if you really do believe that our democracy itself is at stake, in that our election system, the integrity of our election system is at stake, what do you have to do in these midterm elections to correct that? Is there anything you can do?
Well, part of it is...
If I ask another. Can you possibly defend democracy and vote for an election denier at the same time?
Millions of Americans will.
Doesn't answer my question, Major.
But millions of Americans will, and that's why this conversation is so vital. It's why we wrote the book, because it goes to a deeper thing where the idea of denying the 2020 election or raising questions about it, which isn't really what happens, it's full denialism, has now become a litmus test within the nominating process of the Republican Party. That's not sustainable for the Republican Party, okay? David McCormick ran for the Senate nomination as a Republican in Pennsylvania. He trailed Mehmet Oz by about 1,000 votes. He was entitled to a recount. The recount began, and about a third of the way through, David McCormick called it off. Why? For the same reason that anyone who trails by 1,000 votes, who's granted a recall, calls it off. They're not going to catch up. 1,000 votes isn't close. It looks close, but it's not close. And David McCormick saw the math. His team said, you're not going to catch up. Call it a day. So under the system that Pennsylvania had in 2020, through a process where the votes were cast and counted, 1,000 votes wasn't going to be overcome. In Arizona, Carrie Lake ran for governor as a Republican. She said before the votes were cast, there was fraud in that election. While the votes were being cast, she said there was fraud being committed. And then something very interesting happened. She went ahead. And as soon as she went ahead, the fraud disappeared. Okay, this is playing out in real time. This is evidentiary proof that the underlying system does work, and that people who raise these fraud alarms are doing so tactically, not genuinely. And our argument, our very strong, passionate argument in this book is you cannot treat the solidity of this system and slandering it as a tactic. That's out of bounds. That is completely out of bounds for both parties. And we fear a world in which this tactical orientation to the safety and security of our elections becomes endemic. And if it does, we're done.
So, David, you've studied elections. This is your work, your life's work.
Mm-hmm.
How would you rate the security and stability of the American electoral system?
So first I want to point out to everyone who's listening, and I don't think everyone realizes, we run some of the most complex elections in the world. We're incredibly decentralized. We have about 10,000 individual election jurisdictions in the country. We rely upon tens of thousands of professional election workers, Republicans, Democrats, nonpartisans. We rely upon hundreds of thousands of volunteer poll workers. We run elections a lot. There's a saying in most election offices, if it's Tuesday, it must be election day. Because elections don't happen once every 2 years. They happen all the time. If you're from California, as I am, and we are,
all of us are.
It is. There's literally 24 elections in a calendar year. Doesn't matter whether it's an odd year or an even numbered year. They happen all the time. Election workers are constantly working. Not only are elections very decentralized, and we have a lot of elections, but anyone who's voted, particularly in states like California or Florida and others, know there are dozens of races on the ballot, and sometimes the ballot has dozens of pages. Elsewhere in the world, when they go to vote, they go to vote once every few years, and there is one race on the ballot. It is for usually their member of parliament or for their national leader in a nationally coordinated single election. In France, one of the election deniers' latest things, and this came up in Arizona, is France hand counts ballots immediately on election night. Why can't we do that in the United States? In France, they have one race. They have one colored piece of paper that you put into an envelope and hand to someone. You're in and out of the polling place in 10 seconds. Have any of you been in and out of the polling place in 10 seconds in the United States of America? You'll be lucky if you can get out in 10 minutes if you really know who you're going to vote for. It's very, very complex. And yet with all that complexity, we have been building up professionalism in this country for 2 decades extraordinarily well. Just think of Florida as an example. In 2000, Florida was an international laughingstock with legitimate election administration problems. In 2020, thanks to the men and women, the county election officials in Florida, Republicans and Democrats, Florida was an international model. They offered easy vote by mail, easy early in-person voting, easy election day voting. They counted their ballots. They knew exactly what the outcomes were at 9:30 p.m. on election night. That shows you about the professionalism that has developed over time. And it is unquestionable, and I've been watching this for 25 years. I actually go farther back. I go to the Clinton administration. We have the most secure, accessible elections that we've ever had in the United States of America right now, which is not to say that they won't improve over time, and it will. But we are as professionally secure and accessible as we ever have been. And we should celebrate that fact. We should have confidence in that fact and know that sometimes, I know this is crazy, in a democracy that's 50-50, your candidate might lose. Wrap your arms around that for a second.
Yeah.
I mean, that shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, but we are now in a position where we're seeing losing candidates, and I use the plural intentionally now because it's not just the former president, it is a whole circle of grifters that has surrounded him, who are profiting off of this grift, who are selling the big lie that unless we win, we literally heard this from a candidate in Arizona the other day on CNN, that I will accept the verdict if I win, period. That's all.
I wonder who he
That's
heard
not
that from.
how it works.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Back to, again, this morning, I picked this up and I went right back to the book. There's a new poll out today from AP and NORC, whoever they are, by the way. I'm not really sure. And they asked the question, is our democracy working well? Mm-hmm. David, I accept everything you said. 9%.
Right.
9% of Americans said our democracy is working well.
Right. Now, some on the left have questions with the functionality of our democracy. They look at the popular vote total. Does it translate to House representation? No, it doesn't. That looks to be a structural flaw to some people who would describe themselves as either as liberals or progressives or Democrats. See, wait a minute. The popular vote is this, yet when we translate it through redistricting, it gets watered down into something much smaller. There's frustrations about the filibuster. Does a filibuster feel consistent with our understanding in the modern era of democracy and a functioning democracy when states with much less population have as much clout as states with much larger population, and the filibuster requiring the 60-vote threshold? Will either party ever get to that? And if not, how do we work these things through? That goes to questions of functionality of democracy. So I think it can be interpreted broadly in a poll like that. What David and I are saying is those are bigger, broader questions. And they do go to how comfortable Americans are with the way this constitutional republic, Republicans always remind me, we don't have a pure democracy in a Major Garrett. We have a constitutional republic. Yes, it's true. What is our comfortability with that? And these strictures, is the filibuster outdated? That's something that will be constantly debated in the United States Senate, and political pressure will apply as that debate continues. Same thing in the House of Representatives. California was among the first states to have an independent commission to set up districting lines after the census was taken. Other states are moving in that direction. That's an adaptation. So there are lots of ways in which people find in the last, I think, 10 or 15 years, areas in which they're less satisfied than they used to be. What we talk about is how we cast and count ballots and trying to end this idea that denialism about that process can in any way be legitimate or defended.
But if there's that lack of confidence in our democratic process, how do we fix it?
Well, so we answer the question in the book. Do we know who got more votes than their opponent? 100% yes. We know that better than we ever have, and we can transparently show our work. And we've done that repeatedly. And when I say we, I mean we as a society, we've done that. In fact, many of the people who questioned the election over 100 plus members of Congress, many members of state legislatures, literally gained the authority to question the outcome of the election because they were elected on the very same ballots they were questioning. Again, wrap your mind around this for a second. The very same pieces of paper, every single member of Congress that was questioning the outcome of the election was on that same piece of paper. Okay? So we know the answer to that. There are bigger policy questions about democracy, redistricting, the Electoral College, various state laws that differ. Those are all legitimate. Those are all within the boundaries of democracy. But what we have right now is a fundamental lack of accepting of reality. We have one side, and it's not just Democrats, by the way. There are many brave Republicans who have said this as well, who says the sky is blue. And we have another side that says the sky is polka dotted. That's not two sidesism. One of those things is absolutely, definably, verifiably true, and we have to accept that. Now, are there other issues in our democracy that we have to address? 100%. But the democratic process, elections, is how we resolve those. Mm-hmm. This is a point Major was just making, if we undermine the very foundation, the very fundamentals by which we resolve our disputes, we're not a democracy, we're not a constitutional republic anymore. We will devolve into anarchy, and we're starting to see some of that, and the use of political violence as a tool. I just want to point out one other quick thing, which is that, we talk about this in the book. There have been other near crises in our past. Mm-hmm. The 1960 presidential election was very close, decided by one state, and the sitting vice president was a candidate, the losing candidate, and Vice President Nixon, presided over the Electoral College victory of his opponent. 2000, the same thing, opposite. Democratic sitting vice president was the losing candidate in one state that was decided by 537 votes. And that sitting vice president presided over the Electoral College victory of his opponent. They were both patriots in that circumstance to do what they did. They put the country above themselves and their party. This is the first time in American history we've seen someone who lost, let's be honest, not a particularly close election. It was the widest margin of any presidential election in the 21st century where Barack Obama wasn't on the ballot by a large margin, 7 million votes, minimum of 3 states deciding this election. And instead, we've seen a campaign run for nearly 2 years, and actually it predates that, it goes longer than 2 years, as we point out in the book, and we've learned from the January 6th committee where this was being planned even before they knew they were going to lose the election. This undermining of the very foundation by which we resolve our disputes in this country.
I would add to that, for this purpose only, add to the list of patriots Richard Nixon and Al Gore and Mike Pence.
Yes, absolutely.
Who refused to do what the president wanted him to do and single-handedly named the next president of the United States. Right. It's gotten so serious, Major, and you talk about this in the book. Mm-hmm. By the way, you guys get to some really direct and very specific improvements that you think steps we should make to improve the process, which I want to get to. Mm-hmm. But first, you talk about this in the book, and we hear it a lot. People talking about, particularly I might say on the extreme right, about civil war. Mm-hmm. I saw today that the day, August 8, when the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago, on Twitter, the mention of the need for the possibility of civil war went up 3,000%. Mm-hmm. Stuart Rhodes, who's on trial right now, says we're not going to get through this without a civil war. But you've had some Republican lawmakers talk about civil war.
Play footsie with this concept.
What does that do to the discussion?
So we open the book by quoting someone who we think could offer some insight on this very important question. Finian O'Toole's a writer for the Irish Times. He grew up in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And wrote a piece in The Atlantic that said, let me tell you something about talking about civil war. The more you talk about it, the more likely it is to happen. It creates an energy all of its own. A rhetorical energy, a psychic energy. And it makes this thing you're talking about casually more likely to happen. Not inevitable, but more likely to happen. Now, I consider him, that's why he's in the introduction of the book, much more of an authority on this large topic than I am. I have my fears. I have no lived experience. Finian O'Toole has lived experience. So we took that on board as a way to say, all right, David Becker and Major Garrett might not know very much about Civil War and its rhetoric and its rhetorical implications. But here's a guy who does. And what is really important about what you mentioned about the Mar-a-Lago execution of a search warrant is that there was a distinct migration. There was plenty of talk before January 6th about civil war, but they were embedded in the deeper recesses of the web, the darker corners of the web.
Yeah.
After the Mar-a-Lago execution of the search warrant, Twitter, Facebook, other places that are much more commonly trafficked and are much, much more broadly monitored and observed and observable, there was this very intense migration. So what does that tell us? That tells us that those who are speaking this way feel more empowered to speak this way and don't feel any either societal pressure not to do that or hesitation or maybe even work consequences or anything else. That to me is a worrying sign. Mm-hmm. And the sense of alienation and resentment vividly on display at January 6th is something all of us should take on board. Because as David said, not everyone who is disappointed with the 2020 election or raises questions about it is an insurrectionist, but those who were there, many of them were. And they were attacking the Capitol saying, this is our house, and because it's our house, we're going to destroy it. Now that's a kind of mental process that really needs to be looked at. It's my house, and I'm here to destroy it. Wow. I mean, that's a long road to travel, psychologically, okay? And one of the things we talk about in the book is that part of what this denialism is about isn't about, obviously, the evidence. It really hasn't ever been, but under closer and closer scrutiny, it can't possibly be. But it is about a sense of identity and attachment and psychology and what is my part in the American story. And alienation from that pulls you away from institutional norms. It pulls you away from traditions. It pulls you away from all the rhetorical flourishes of the person who helped make this building, Abraham Lincoln. And that distance is not going to be closed overnight. But I do believe, David and I wouldn't have written this book if we didn't believe it was closable, because these facts are never going to change. They just aren't.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.